It's interesting because there are sort of, the meat industry as a whole is a very large thing, right? And there's obviously like components of it, and so aspects of it are supportive and aspects are not, and that's partly affected by how it's going to affect their bottom line. So Tyson, for example, had invested in Beyond Meat. Cargill has invested in Memphis Meats. And so there are definitely industry incumbents that are on board because they can see that this is going to be part of the future.
Well, tonight I'm delighted to have a diverse group of speakers, all of whom are in some way connected with food, health, and trends in what we eat. To help us dissect the issues, we have Dr. Walter Willett, Harvard Professor of Epidemiology and Nutrition, and author of the book, Eat, Drink, and Be Healthy, which will be on sale after the program's over. Nina Gheihman, a PhD candidate in sociology at Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. She's been studying the new food trends and entrepreneurship in the vegan movement. And finally, we have two living, breathing entrepreneurs, Truman French and Tucker Pforzheimer, who are startup guys from Martha's Vineyard. And they've been growing and selling shiitake mushrooms for the past 5 years, very successfully. They now produce 15,000-pound crop of shiitakes annually, and they're supplying restaurants in New York and Boston. Well, with that, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Willett.
The topic of meat and how it fits into our health and well-being and also environmental sustainability is a huge topic. I, in this short time, can just skim over this a little bit. I will start off talking about the evidence relating meat to long-term health and well-being, in particular red meat. There's no perfect way to study the relationship between red meat or anything else in the diet and long-term health, whether it be heart disease or total mortality or any other outcome. The ideal study in principle would be that you'd, at birth, randomize people to either several servings of red meat per day or some other alternative source of protein, and then follow us through the decades till late in life and see how long we lived and what happened to us along the way. As you can well imagine, we'll never do such a study in humans anyway. So we are usually in the position of needing to piece together different kinds of information. And I'll talk very briefly about the different kinds of information that do lead us to the conclusion that red meat is certainly far from an optimal source of food or protein in the diets of most people. But that it may not have to necessarily be zero. It really is, there's a spectrum of dose-response relationship. One of the first kinds of pieces of evidence relates to the effects of red meat on risk factors for disease. And this can be looked at in short-term studies. For example, just randomizing a few dozen people to different levels of red meat intake and following them for a few weeks and examining what happens to, say, their blood cholesterol levels or their blood pressure or other intermediate risk factors for cardiovascular disease or other conditions. We have a huge body of data, many dozens of studies looking at the different kinds of fats and how that relates to, say, blood cholesterol levels. They show very clearly that higher amounts of saturated fat in the diet increase blood cholesterol, and particularly the LDL form of cholesterol that's most related to heart disease. And on the other hand, polyunsaturates and monounsaturates reduce blood cholesterol levels. Just on that basis alone, you'd be suspicious about red meat because it does contain quite high amounts of saturated fat and also very low amounts of polyunsaturated fat. For example, many of the oils in seeds and nuts, soybean oil, contain up to 60-70% polyunsaturates in the diet. Red meat only has 4%, and poultry is somewhere in the middle, about 20 or 30% of polyunsaturated fat in the diet. So just on that basis, and this is indirect, but certainly an important clue, that you'd be suspicious about high amounts of red meat in the diet, especially if you're comparing it to foods that are more plant-based. There's another level of evidence, actually randomized trials where people were assigned different amounts of red meat per se. This is not just the pure fats. And then followed for a few weeks again to look at intermediate risk factors like blood cholesterol, blood pressure, and other risk factors for heart disease. And here there's a really important issue, and that's what's the comparison group, what's the control group in this kind of study? And that makes a huge difference in the outcome. For example, there was a paper published a few years ago, indirectly funded by the beef industry, saying that red meat has no adverse effect on cardiovascular risk factors, including blood cholesterol levels. The fatal problem with this study was that these were different. This was a summary of different randomized control studies, what's called a meta-analysis, and they threw together all different kinds of studies. In some studies, the comparison group was other animal protein sources like fish or poultry. Others, it was just their usual diet. And if you understand the diets of Americans, the usual diet is mostly junk. And there were a few studies that had plant-based sources of protein, such as nuts and legumes. And if you throw all these studies together, I think, not too unexpectedly find that red meat's no worse than most of the bad stuff in the American diet. So we recently published an analysis where we separated the studies by the comparison group. And not surprisingly, if you look specifically at red meat compared to plant-based protein sources such as nuts, legumes, soy products, then red meat did have an adverse effect on LDL cholesterol and also raised triglycerides in the blood, which also predict higher rates of coronary heart disease. Well, high blood cholesterol predicts heart disease, but heart disease is more complicated than just cholesterol levels. So it's really important to have studies that also look at heart disease, which is what we're really trying to prevent. And there, we don't have any long-term randomized trials. It's probably impossible, or at least very hard to imagine, that you could really do a study randomizing people to high or low red meat and follow them for many years. You'd need many thousands of people, and it's just extremely difficult to keep people on assigned diets like that for long periods of time. So the next best kind of study will usually be long-term epidemiologic studies. Our group has conducted such studies, and other people have as well. In our studies, we've started actually our first cohort in 1980, and we're still following that group. We're now following several 100,000 people. And interestingly, if we, like the controlled feeding studies, if we look at just how red meat intake relates to risk of heart disease, coronary heart disease in particular, we see just a small increase in risk of coronary heart disease. But again, that's because in this simple kind of analysis, you're comparing red meat by default with everything else in the diet, all the other bad stuff, refined starch, sugar, partially hydrogenated fats. And no big surprise, red meat is only a little bit worse than all that other bad stuff. But if you compare red meat specifically with other protein sources, like poultry, dairy products, and especially with plant-based protein sources, then red meat is clearly related to higher risk of coronary heart disease. So we have, putting all this together, we do have quite a strong body of evidence, not the perfect study, which we'll never have, but the weight of evidence from these different lines of investigation does clearly show that red meat, I think with very high probability, is related to higher risk of heart disease. We've also looked at, in similar ways, at risk of type 2 diabetes, an increased risk with red meat compared to these other protein sources, especially compared to plant protein sources. And colorectal cancer, especially their processed red meat, is related to higher risk. So if you put all this together, again, there's quite a substantial body of evidence that says that high red meat diets are not going to be the optimal diets. But there's more than one way to have an unhealthy diet. And you can load up with Coca-Cola and donuts and things like that and also have an unhealthy diet. That's, red meat is not, high consumption is not the only path toward an unhealthy diet. Then there's the issue that how does red meat relate to environmental sustainability? And this is really a critical issue. We've, for quite a while, realized that Greenhouse gases and climate change are important, but not very long ago we thought that this was going to be something that would make a difference 500 years from now or 1,000 years from now. But what's happened is that there's an acceleration in climate change. We're into vicious circles that are speeding up the rate of climate change in particular, and we're having many other adverse environmental outcomes as well. But the climate change is clearly an existential issue for human civilization as we know it, and you've probably all read multiple reports coming from different international reviews that we have really a short period of time in which to make major changes if we're going to avoid ecological disaster and really unstable populations, many other adverse outcomes. And it turns out that diet, food, really does make a difference in the effects on the environment, and particular climate change. A number of investigators have done what we call life cycle analyses, looking at the environmental footprints of different foods in the diet. And red meat is an outlier by itself. There's various kinds of calculations. Not everybody gets the same number, but red meat in terms of greenhouse gas production, whether it's per gram of protein or per calorie, has often 50 to several hundred times the amount of greenhouse gas production compared to protein sources such as nuts, legumes, red meat. Dairy products and poultry are somewhere in the middle. They're not nearly as bad as red meat, but many times higher in their impact compared to plant-based protein sources. So making shifts away from red meat to these other sources of protein clearly will have a major impact on the environment. I was part of an international panel for the last several years, and we issued a report in January called the Eat Lancet report, published in the Lancet magazine, that brought together 35 scientists from 17 countries. And we spent a lot of weekends and evenings working on this, looking at the question whether we could feed what will be about 10 billion people by 2050 a diet that is both healthy and sustainable. And we did find that there was a way to do this, but it's a very small needle to thread. It does mean major shifts in diets of countries like the United States that consume large amounts of red meat and other animal protein sources. But I should add that other parts of the world already have very low intakes of red meat. South Asia, most people in Africa have much lower consumption of red meat. So we can't say just that people need to decrease their intake. It really depends where we're starting from. So we use the word limit. And we came up, first of all, starting with the health effects, what an optimal red meat intake might be. And we came up with, I won't go into all the basis of the numbers, but between 0 and 14 grams a day. And 0 because you can have a very healthy diet being a vegan, so 0 would have to be included in the range. And up to 14 grams a day is based on where we see elevations in risk of diabetes start to occur. What does 14 grams a day mean? That's about 1 hamburger a week, or if you like big juicy steaks, that's about a 12-ounce steak once a month. That may seem extreme to many Americans, but we did some reality testing of this and looked at the traditional Mediterranean diet. When back in the 1960s, Greek men lived 4 years longer than American men, and their consumption of red meat plus poultry was about 35 grams a day. We did allow in these target numbers about 28 grams of poultry per day. And so that comes out to be about 43 grams of red meat plus protein, a little bit higher than the traditional Mediterranean diet. So that was a great diet in terms of flavors, enjoyability, and longevity. These numbers are very compatible with that amount. And we did some sensitivity analyses. Again, limiting red meat consumption on average to 14 grams a day. We could squeak by in terms of, it looks like being able to feed 10 billion people a healthy and sustainable diet. But if we let that red meat number go up to 50 grams a day, that would be about 2 or 3 hamburgers a week. it doesn't work. We couldn't find a way to have a healthy and sustainable diet for the global population. So the constraints are pretty tight here. Now, we did allow some dairy products into the diet. We put as a target number an amount that would be about 1 glass of milk a day or an equivalent amount of cheese. And that is not too different than the average consumption in the world today, actually, although the consumption is concentrated, of course, much higher in the United States and European countries in particular. If we have some dairy products in the diet, there will also inevitably be some red meat in the diet too, because first of all, you have male bovines, male cattle being born, and they don't give milk, so we eat them either as veal or some other source of protein. And by the time dairy cows start to reduce their production of milk, they get turned into hamburger too. So the food supply is a complicated issue. There's some lands that can only be used for grazing, so there's likely to be some meat produced there. But the bottom line is, if we limit our consumption of red meat, we will both be healthier, and it is part of the picture, an important part of the picture, to having a healthy and sustainable diet for the global population. Thank you.
I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at Harvard, and for the last 3 years, I've been conducting research on entrepreneurship in the vegan movement. When I started my research in 2015, the topic seemed marginal at best, with many people questioning why I chose such a niche subject. Little did I know that within a few short years, the Impossible Burger would be served at Clover Food Lab in Harvard Square and in Burger Kings across the nation. Beyond Meat's IPO would become one of the most successful stock debuts in history, and people far beyond Silicon Valley would hear about cultivated or lab-grown meat. Indeed, my dissertation has led me down many different rabbit holes, asking questions such as, what happens to our concept of meat when it is built from plants or grown in a laboratory and no animals are slaughtered? What happens to our notion of veganism in a world where conventional meat is no longer the social norm? What happens to our very notion of what it means to be human when meat has been a key element in our evolution? You probably know already that meat has huge consequences for the planet, human health, animal welfare, and food security worldwide. Livestock are responsible for 14.5% of the global greenhouse gas emissions and the vast majority of the Amazon rainforest destruction. 1/3 of the world's arable land is used to grow feed for livestock, food that could otherwise be fed to starving people elsewhere. A report commissioned by the World Resources Institute, the World Bank, and the United Nations showed that if we stay on our present course, we will clear the world's forests, wipe out species, and release enough greenhouse gases to far exceed the 2 degrees outlined in the Paris Agreement. Meanwhile, people in the West are dying from chronic diseases that are preventable through largely plant-based diets, as Dr. Willett just outlined. And that is not even to mention the animal welfare issues of industrial animal agriculture and related issues such as antibiotic resistance due to their preventative use in factory farms to deal with overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. Despite these realities, we face a meat paradox. Most people know that meat is bad for their health and for the environment, but both the per capita and total amount of meat consumed is rising globally, driven by already high demand in developed nations and population growth, urbanization, and rising incomes in the developing world. By 2050, the world's population will grow to nearly 10 billion, raising the crucial question of how to feed all these people without hastening climate change and expediting planetary disaster. A recent paper published in Science by researchers from Oxford concluded that avoiding meat and dairy is the single biggest way to reduce your impact on the Earth. And yet, how many of us are willing to give up meat? Turns out, probably only about 5%, a number that has shifted little for decades despite the efforts of educational campaigns. Faced with these realities, entrepreneurs, many of them former animal welfare and environmental activists, became disillusioned with the potential of convincing people to change their behavior. Instead of changing people, they decided to change meat. Sure, alternatives to conventional meat have existed for decades, but they were made for those willing to give up meat, not for meat lovers.
The new entrepreneurs are targeting you, the omnivore, who in a few years' time will no longer be able to tell the difference. Actually, it's not even you, the person living in elite Cambridge, but instead those in the middle of the country for whom meat is a staple 3 times a day, or the newly middle-class person in China or Brazil who views meat as a status symbol and wants more, just like us. So how are these entrepreneurs trying to revolutionize meat? Well, they have taken what sociologists might call a techno-optimistic approach, believing that technology can solve the social ills that plague us today. Indeed, they have gone so far as to characterize the cow as an outdated piece of technology to be disrupted in the Silicon Valley ethos. They have done this in 2 ways, what is known as plant-based or the cultivated or cell-based approach. Plant-based involves the creation of meat from plant ingredients such as peas, potatoes, coconut oil, and today accounts for less than 1% of the meat market. Cultivated or cell-based involves growing real meat from animal cells in laboratories, and it is not yet on the market. These entrepreneurs are taking a biomimicry approach, trying to replicate not only the taste, but the olfactory and sensual experience of eating a piece of meat. Indeed, the company Impossible discovered and engineered a molecule called heme that gives meat its distinctive metallic umami flavor, which they added to their burgers. And Beyond Meat's burgers bleed beet juice. Meanwhile, Memphis Meats showcased a meatball they created in a laboratory without the slaughter of any animal involved. These entrepreneurs are saying, we are here not to take away your hamburgers, but instead to make your beloved burgers in novel ways. And if they succeed, it is not an exaggeration to say that these products may be one of the few chances we have for survival. Indeed, recent research shows that a Beyond Burger, which you can now get locally at Whole Foods, Star Market, or even Market Basket, generates 90% less greenhouse gases, requires 46% less energy, has 99% less impact on water scarcity, and 93% less impact on land use than a quarter pound of US beef. It may sound like science fiction, but a recent projection showed that by 2040, plant-based meat may account for as much as 25% and cell-based for 35% of the global market for meat. What are the chances that these entrepreneurs will revolutionize meat? Well, you may be surprised to know they have allies in unlikely places. All these companies have formed strategic partnerships with industry incumbents, including Tyson, Cargill, Purdue, and even the North American Meat Institute, a trade group representing conventional meat producers. These large companies see the writing on the wall and want to be involved in the future of meat, while for the startups, these partnerships offer an opportunity to scale quickly and penetrate the existing market more effectively, rather than taking an antagonistic David versus Goliath approach. These entrepreneurs are savvy about the regulatory and market landscape, and they're actively anticipating the roadblocks toward bringing this meat to the masses. No doubt there is resistance both from conventional meat producers and ideological vegans as well to the capitalization of the vegan movement. And there are still many unanswered questions about the healthfulness, environmental impact, and the scalability of these technologies. I am myself vegan. I've been vegan for 4 years now, and personally, I eat a plant-based diet very similar to the one that Walter Willett just outlined for us. But the reality is that most people are unwilling to make such changes. And so whatever our reservations may be as advocates or as critics, the reality is that these entrepreneurs are already here, and their work may indeed spell the end of meat as we know it. The twist in that story, however, is that it has a sequel and may represent an entirely new era in humanity's relationship to animals, to the planet, and to our deepest cravings for meat. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tucker Pforzheimer. This is my business partner, Truman French. And how many people have read The Third Plate? Could you just raise hands? By Dan Barber? Cool. One guy. So The Third Plate outlines less of a techno-optimistic approach to the problem of solving our food system and more of an efficiency advantageous approach, efficiency arbitrage, let's call it. Truman and I got into mushrooms in the mycology class at Harvard. That's where we met. And after examining a map of the band of oak forest that runs roughly from the Appalachians through the Catskills up through New Hampshire to coastal Maine, and then observing how that band might change with projected climate change, we started thinking about how important it is to not only eat locally, but produce in a locally specific fashion. So what that means is that we have a global food system. Things are grown with tons of fertilizer, tons of water, things that are trucked in from other places and oftentimes manufactured with petrochemicals. But it doesn't have to be like that. The biosphere is tremendously productive, or it has been in the past. And many, many cultures previous to ours have, instead of working against what they were given to produce specific commodities for market demand, instead observed the natural environment, tried different things, and worked with it to provide themselves with food. Now, that's included everything from game animals to fruits to fish and shrimp in the ocean. Truman grew up Buddhist. I was raised by a chef, so I ate basically anything, and Truman doesn't eat any meat or eggs. Truman felt more strongly about a plant-based diet than I ever did. But as we examined his home of Martha's Vineyard for a potential business venture, we quickly discovered that New England, with its terrible soil, humid climate, and cold winters, was not ideal for growing very much except for mushrooms. Now, the cool thing about that oak band of forest is it doesn't just exist in the United States, it also happens to exist in the Japanese archipelago and the southern Korean peninsula, as well as in certain mountain valleys in China. And over in that part of the world, what evolved to grow on that fallen oak were shiitake mushrooms. Shiitake is a Japanese word. It means oak mushroom. So shiitake mushrooms means oak mushrooms. Shi is the specific type of oak that grows in Japan. But given what the vineyard has to offer, an ocean-mediated climate, very humid, generally mild falls, and, as it so happens, a ridiculous amount of oak. It's almost an oak monoculture forest. Anytime anyone is clearing land on the island, they are cutting down oak logs. And people clear land. It's a fact of life. The cool thing about oak forest, which people in Japan have taken advantage of for hundreds of years, is that an oak tree does something called coppicing. So if you cut down an oak log, and you can drive through any oak forest around Massachusetts and see this for yourself, the tree doesn't die. It lives on in the root system, and oak saplings will grow from around that log in a ring. So if you see a ring of oak trees, that was probably a larger oak tree that was cut down at some point, the stump was left, and it regrew. So an oak tree is a tremendously renewable resource. So what we went on to devise was not a unique production system, but one very well adapted to where we were specifically. We essentially borrowed from Japanese, Korean, and Chinese techniques to create a farm that uses no fertilizer, no insecticides, no fungicides, no soil, no climate controls, no irrigation, and about, Truman estimated today, 25 gallons of diesel a week. So off of that, we're producing approximately, it varies depending on exact temperature. It's part of the joy of farming outside. But between 500 and 800, had a couple 1,000-pound weeks every week. Now, this shiitake mushroom that we produce just so happens to be delicious in the way that Impossible and Beyond are trying in their labs to make a meat replacement, but naturally so. It's very nutritious, and I'm talking about, we did a comparative nutritional assay against commodity-grown shiitake mushrooms, which I'll say more about in a second. It's about double the dietary fiber. This means that the mushrooms that grow on the whole oak logs outdoors, as they evolved to do, have as much dietary fiber per serving as oats, which has long had that little heart-healthy stamp from the American Cardiovascular Society on the Quaker cylinder. They also have about 3 grams of protein per serving, which is an 85-gram serving. Now, is it as much as beef? No, but per gram, our farming technique uses 70 times less water to produce 1 gram of shiitake protein as it takes to produce 1 gram of beef protein. If you expand that to look at land use, everyone knows that a cow is not just grown on the land where it lives. It's grown on soy farms from the Amazon. It's grown on corn and wheat. Well, hopefully not wheat, but it's grown on a variety of feedstocks. That works out to about, this is the popular figure, and please correct me if I'm wrong later, Dr. Willett and Nina, but 64 square feet per quarter pound of beef. That's including the feedstocks. So we ran those numbers for our mushrooms, including the wood that we use, and this is, again, an oak forest is a sustainable thing. It will keep regrowing if it's managed, and that's all forestry in New England for a number of years since we clear-cut it the first time, has been sustainably managed. It's 36 times more efficient than beef. So again, it's much nicer, I think, to have the amount of land, albeit 1/36 of it, covered in forest as would be covered in feedstocks. So that's how we fit in here. What we found in the broader mushroom market is that commodity mushrooms, which are grown on a pasteurized substrate, when you pasteurize something, you boil it, it loses a lot of the nutrients. A mushroom is a consumer. It doesn't produce its own food, so what you're feeding it, just like a cow, is what's going into the mushroom and what you are then consuming. So they're vastly more, the way that we do it is vastly more nutritious, but it's also not replacing the way we sell it, other mushrooms. So we're not going into restaurants and replacing their shiitake mushrooms with ours, partially because ours are more expensive, and we do that kind of on purpose so that they don't end up, as many mushrooms do, as a garnish for filet mignon, but instead as a center of plate protein on their own. I think interestingly, just anecdotally, what I've heard from chefs more and more as these meat replacement products have come out beyond Impossible is a frustration that people won't just eat more plants or more mushrooms. And in short, that's what we're trying to do, is provide people with an unprocessed alternative that is high in fiber, will improve their health, and can be grown essentially with no inputs. So that's a little bit about us.
It seems like there's a very strong argument ecologically for us to change our ways. How has the meat lobby been? You said people like Tyson and are investigating the alternatives, but are they not fighting just even using the word meat? I thought they were taking you to court if you used the word meat and it wasn't from an animal.
So there actually has been, there's been kind of a pushback from parts of the meat industry to kind of label meat as something that comes from an animal that's sort of been slaughtered rather than, plant-based. And so same thing is happening with milk. And so it's interesting because there are sort of, the meat industry as a whole is a very large thing, right? And there's obviously like components of it. And so aspects of it are supportive and aspects are not. And that's partly affected by how it's going to affect their bottom line. So Tyson, for example, had invested in Beyond Meat. Cargill has invested in Memphis Meats. And so there are definitely industry incumbents that are on board because they can see that this is going to be part of the future, and so they want to be involved. But there are obviously kind of the Beef Cattlemen's Association, for example, very much pushing back it's in terms of regulation and nomenclature. So there's also that element.
Tucker and Truman, when you're going to pitch your mushrooms in restaurants, do you kind of emphasize the meatiness of the product?
Yeah.
Do you actually use the word?
Yeah, absolutely. What we say is it's a center of plate protein, which is code for you dress it with vegetables and sauces, but you don't need to put it with meat. It is meat on its own.
Well, it's high in umami as well. I mean, you alluded to how they're using basically an umami derivative to enhance the burgers they're producing. It's a naturally occurring umami flavor in the shiitakes as well. So.
Walter, to you before we open it up. How responsible do you think is the government for misleading the American public into this healthy, the triangle that was the pyramid that was all wrong, and then they revised it and it's still all wrong. How responsible are they for producing part of the problem in the American diet?
Clearly, the meat industry, all the industries are out there pushing their own product. And it's not only the meat industry. Obviously, big soda was out there, to a large extent, trying to discredit science because it's inconvenient when it shows adverse effects of their products. So the meat industry is very powerful. In fact, before the last dietary guidelines, they got Congress at the last minute to introduce a law into the part of the appropriations bill that the dietary guidelines could say nothing about environmental impacts. And so the dietary guidelines for sure this time are going to say nothing about environmental impacts. It's the law. And then they have very strong influences through various channels at the Department of Agriculture, which is the main part of the government that produces the dietary guidelines. And obviously the main so-called stakeholders, appropriately, of the Department of Agriculture are the big segments of the agriculture community, and dairy and beef being the biggest. So the dietary guidelines are a two-step process. There's a scientific advisory committee that looks over the evidence and issues a report of about 400 pages long, and that's passed to the Department of Agriculture, and then the Department of Agriculture takes that and formulates the guidelines. And that process twisted the conclusions of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee as well, that suggested that there be less red meat and to choose lean red meat as the final guideline. So yes, there's a lot of influence of power and money going on. Unfortunately, the dietary guidelines in principle should be the way to convey the best available evidence, but they're clearly very powerful forces that get in the way.
Veganism is becoming increasingly convenient, tasty, healthy, and has always been environmentally friendly. With all these considerations in mind, what are the big obstacles preventing it from becoming universally accepted?
Well, that's sort of the topic of my dissertation, I guess. I mean, there are many obstacles. There are psychological obstacles that are, there's cognitive dissonance around like what it means when you consume meat. A lot of people sort of know about the fact that, animals are slaughtered in the process, that there are environmental effects, but there are pretty powerful sort of psychological components. There's sociological components. There's a lot of cultural paradigms around the consumption of meat. So meat has very much this high status symbol for the most part still, and of course that's changing to some extent with veganism becoming more mainstream, but it's still the case. And sociological research has shown that people have this sort of certain repertoires that they use kind of on an individual level. Like I personally can't, I adopt a vegan diet. I very much love the meat that I eat, and also kind of more abstract repertoires about sort of, about choice. Like I should be able to choose what to put on my plate, and it's not about the government deciding or someone else deciding, like the industry deciding. So there's those elements, and then of course there's just structural factors. But I think what's important to remember is that the way that we consume meat today was not even normal like 60 years ago. So what seems conventional and normal now was not the case 50 or 60 years ago. So we may be having a very different diet in 50 to 60 years. That's possible. Obviously, there's a lot of institutional entrenchment. There's path dependency, so it's difficult to kind of have these huge institutional changes. But I think that it's possible to have big societal change if there's enough of a push from the right places in society. And it's never going to be just an individual approach or just companies, or it's going to be like systemic shift, I think. And we're starting to see that veganism is becoming mainstream. But as I said in my talk, like what we define as vegan might change if there are cell-based meat or cultivated meat products, or plant-based products become more part of the the shift. So personally, on a personal level, I'd love for everyone to eat more legumes and beans and mushrooms. I love shiitake mushrooms. But I think we are facing really significant problems and in a very short time span, very short amount of time left before we have to make significant changes. So, yeah.
Can I ask you a question? Do you think that there's potential for industry cooperation to create a vegan lobbying giant like Beef Checkoff program was for the beef industry? Because isn't that why we all eat so much beef, is the Beef Checkoff program?
I think that the entrepreneurs in the vegan movement do have similar things to that in mind to some extent. I mean, there are already trade groups there's a trade group for the plant-based food, there's a plant-based food association, there's a trade group for the plant-based industry, and there's just one that formed for the cell-based industry called, it's the shorthand as AMPS, like Alliance for Meat, Poultry, and Seafood Innovation. And so I think there is a push to some extent, but vegans still make up only, 2% of the population.
Sure, but people who grow plants make up a lot of industry.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think it's possible. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I could add just a little bit to that. I think it's important in discussing this to keep in mind that this doesn't have to be a dichotomous world of vegan and non-vegan, that we can accomplish a lot environmentally and a lot health-wise just going closer to more plant-based diet, that having one meat meal a day or something like that, that both there can be huge improvements in health that way. And our targets, again, for this sustainability report are not based on everybody becoming a vegan. In fact, we're sort of literally leaving some food on the table if everybody became a vegan, because there are some places like quite sparse, semi-arid places where grazing is probably the most practical way to use the land, and that would produce some animal source food. So if we're really trying to feed another 2.5 billion people, we're going to have to use all of our resources. So the ability to convert cellulose fiber into food that's one useful function of cattle, and that will produce some meat, some dairy, potentially some dairy. It will be small. But there is some room for that, and I think it's important to we can get a lot more people aboard shifting to a largely plant-based diet rather than sort of saying, oh, you got to become a vegan or not a vegan. And I think a lot of these entrepreneurs like Clover realize that. They get a lot of people in their restaurant because their food's good.
Yeah.
And people enjoy it. They understand it's making a contribution to their health and sustainability, but they're not committing themselves to be 100% vegan. And we are seeing a big shift. One of the other issues is cost. And one of the problems is that the price of eating beef does not internalize all the environmental costs. The direct subsidies are small, but we're not including the price of all the environmental footprints and damage when we get that very inexpensive hamburger.
I think it also relates to oil is very cheap, and we're not accounting for the externalities associated with oil consumption and production, which is, so it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but a pound of beef is somewhere between a half a gallon and a gallon of oil usage, where a lot of the plant-based stuff is a much lower thing. So if oil was to increase in price, the price of beef would go up and make it less competitive, where a lot of the plant-based stuff would not change so much.
The operation of the USDA, and my understanding is our taxpayer dollars go to subsidize the meat and dairy industry. And is there any political will or entrepreneurial will towards shifting the subsidies so that people who are on very limited incomes don't have to eat this cheap meat and make themselves, so we have all these chronic diseases, and shift the subsidies towards plant-based farming, which would, probably encourage people to eat better, which would benefit everyone. And also just economically, if these companies, their goal really is just profits, like any of the Tyson or meat companies, in ethics and health, be damned. It just seems practically that it will be much cheaper for them to, to stop the animal model, that it'll be, when you think about what goes into the resources of making, a hamburger, I just think it'll be more profitable for them. They'll just use less resources and avoid a lot of expense and misery.
Clearly, we need to use the economic levers that we could use much more strongly. That other countries do this. Switzerland, for example, does use market levers, and beef costs a lot there. I think it's $25, $30 a pound, something like that. The direct subsidy, again, is not much at this point in time, but there's a lot of indirect subsidies that are there for meat and dairy, but they're not there for plant-based foods. So we both for environmental reasons and health reasons, we should be using those more. A carbon tax would help a little bit because, again, there's quite a bit of carbon that goes into producing beef. So we need to look at all of those carefully.
I'm Canadian, here doing a master's in English literature, so when I see a new book out, I'm like, whoo, something for me to read. I became a vegetarian 25 years ago when I read John Robbins' Diet for a New America. And after I read that book, I simply couldn't justify anymore eating the way I had eaten as a child. Recently, maybe 5-6 years ago, I read How Not to Die, which I recommend for everybody in the room. Everybody I know has been told, please read this book, and then we'll have a good discussion about it. For 35 years, I've been a flight attendant, and I have to tell you that when you work in the aviation business, you are almost in a petri dish where you see all kinds of things going on all over the world, and I fly internationally. And when I started flying, in Canada, we have a very large East Indian population. And for them to fly back home to India, they would have to go through London or Frankfurt. But since we've gotten the new Airbus, we are able to go all the way there in one shot. And what's interesting to me, and I'm excited to listen and learn about trends, in the olden days when I started flying, our East Indian passengers would always say, we want vegetarian meals, give us vegetarian meals, we want vegetarian meals, and it wasn't an option. So Air Canada went ahead, and on the direct flights now, we offer 80% of our meals on the plane are vegetarian. What's ironic and shocking to me is how many of our East Indian passengers don't want vegetarian meals anymore. So they've come to North America, they've, I was going to say bitten into the standard American diet, North American diet. And what's interesting to me, I also fly to Japan, and I can tell you on an airplane that has 300 passengers going to India, very often we need 175 wheelchairs to help our passengers get off the plane. Going to Japan, I've probably gone 100 times. I've never had one Japanese passenger require a wheelchair. I watch the way people eat. There is a correlation, and I'm thrilled that you're out there doing what you're doing, and I'm thrilled that all of you are here tonight to talk and think and listen to this. There's a correlation, and we need to pay more attention to it. So as I'm knocking on 60, I want to live to be 115 like those people in Japan, and I think diet is the way to do it. So thanks, everybody.
I just recently read a book, I think it's called The Uninhabitable Earth, and it talks about how we have about 10 or 12 years to make a difference, big changes. And I hear you talking about 2040 and 2050, and personally, I don't know if we're going to get there. So what can we do? I mean, how can we motivate people who are eating meat, or which is totally unsustainable, to understand that they need to make fast, dramatic shifts in what they eat, or else we're just not going to be around. So, thanks.
I can start to answer that a little bit. There's obviously, we do need to move quickly. We're probably, I was at a gathering here at the university last night on prospects for climate change with the most senior people. And it's going to be very difficult to keep climate change and temperature increases under 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, which is but that does, even though it's going to be difficult, and maybe we can't do it, still we have to try to have the least bad outcome and move as quickly as we can. And we need to use every possible lever that we can. Obviously, we first need to have national leadership that recognizes that climate change is real and we need to do something about it. That's because at that level we're going in the wrong direction. I think everybody here knows that, and it's a disaster for our children and our grandchildren if we don't reverse that very quickly. On the food front, many things can be done. Right at the university here, the university has committed. Actually, if you saw the Gazette today, there was a story that Harvard Dining signing up with a pledge to work with other groups around the world to change the food in a healthier and more sustainable way. And one of the options that works is just having more delicious plant-based entrees and options out there. That's probably the most effective way to make change. And at the School of Public Health, basically about 2 years ago, the grill there stopped serving beef. And so the grill with no beef is a little bit of a oxymoron almost, but their sales went up 300% because they had lots of healthy, interesting options. There are some plant burgers, but some fish burgers, some chicken burgers as well, but a lot of more interesting, flavorful things than just the plain old hamburger.
Can I just say, the impetus maybe has to be much more urgent and more, because, I mean, that example is wonderful. I read that today, but, you know, Oxford and Cambridge did that 5 years ago. They took meat out of the student cafeteria and, I mean, just dropped like that. And they were publishing the statistics of how much they'd saved in terms of carbon production. So I think people have to be aware of the link, just as you say, the fact that you're not in a wheelchair, real connections between things about the way you live and the way the planet ends up, the way you end up.
I think people need to realize, too, that as a consumer, you're the ones driving the market. And that's been our experience. When people go out and buy our mushrooms, they're supporting sustainable agriculture that is basically zero carbon. And so when you go out to a restaurant, instead of ordering the steak off the menu, you order a mushroom-based dish. You are supporting that business, our business, and that in turn basically aligns with kind of the ideals that everyone's advocating here.
And Truman and I and everyone on the farm talk about this pretty nonstop, and I'll throw it out there because I know you want to say it, but we won't prevent a certain amount of climate change. It's not going to happen. It's too late. Systems are too entrenched. What I hold out hope for personally is that the disruption that climate change causes to our current unsustainable economy will naturally provide growth for adaptive business and adaptive change. And I think that that's really what we're putting our foot down is on the world of 2050, not a world of 2050 that looks like the world today, but the world of 2050 where the oak forest band has taken over all the beech hardwood in northern New York as well because it's 10 degrees warmer in the summer.
Well, and transportation isn't very cheap, so it's hard to move commoditized soy around the world to feed feedlots and
this is in the climate disrupted world of 2050.
Exactly.
It's being ready for that, being ready to work with what we'll have without the carbon intensive economy of today.
Also, if you think back to the Second World War, I mean, you know, coming from the rationing that went on for years after the war, people just put up, it was just considered, that's what we're doing, has to be done. So, I mean, I know that sounds awful to use the word ration to an American, but, you know, I mean, if it means survival, why not ration? So you can only have meat, you know, have your little meat book or your egg book, and you only have it so many days a month. I mean, nobody's going to die without meat.
That's why, I mean, I also like believe in sort of individual consumer choice and so on, but I really think that like policy changes like that, like where it's like a carbon tax or like some kind of like thing where it just totally changes the incentive structure, and therefore like people they're going to willingly not buy things because they're too expensive or so on, or there's a ration system in place and so on. I know there's this like element of like, oh, we can't influence people's, personal choice and freedom, but it's like if there's like this global effect, I mean, I think that that's a reasonable use of the kind of
You either learn the lesson the hard way or you make a policy change.
And unfortunately, honestly, like on a personal level, it's hard for me to have hope because, I mean, I tried to hold it out, but it's just the way that things they're sort of evolving now politically and so on. It's hard not to sort of feel a little bit depressed about the outcomes. Yeah.
I've been following the plant-based burgers with interest. I've tried the Beyond and the Impossible meat, and they taste pretty decent. Not identical to meat, but still pretty decent. And I thought that was a great thing. But the more I looked into it, the more I found it's not clear that these plant-based burgers are any healthier for you than beef is. Mm-hmm. The main thing that's wrong with beef is it's high in saturated fat. And the plant-based burgers are high in saturated fat because they add it to make it taste more like beef. And they're high in salt. They're high in genetically modified foods, if you're into that. They're high in lots of chemicals. So if you look at the big picture, because they're trying to make it artificially taste like meat, they're creating something which may be actually less healthy for you than meat. So, I mean, the one ingredient in meat is meat. If you want to have a plant-based diet, I would say eat plants. Have salads, vegetables, whole grains, blah, blah, blah. But the simulated meat is not necessarily better for you than actual meat.
Yeah, well, thank you for making that point. I think that's basically true. We need to look at everything we do through, a health lens and simultaneously an environmental lens. The Impossible Burger, many of these other fake burgers are not very far probably from the natural beef in terms of their health effects. There is some flexibility. They have the option of making the fat component less saturated, more healthy, but they've only moved a little bit in that direction, and they contain quite a bit more sodium than beef actually doesn't contain much sodium naturally. So you're absolutely right. They don't contain the positive health-promoting benefits that plant-based foods naturally have. But I still think there's a place for them. That I make the analogy to a nicotine patch. For somebody who really can't get off of smoking, the nicotine patch is better than active smoking, but it's not very far from an optimal solution. You're still addicted to nicotine. So there's a role for this. Also, their commercial price wholesale for Impossible Burger is $12 a pound now. So this isn't the solution for the world in terms
with venture capitalist runway.
Pardon?
With VC money.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So inevitably, it's a very industrial product that's going to be more expensive than having natural plant-sourced foods, which are inherently relatively inexpensive. So, but still, it's good that we have lots of options because people are all different places, and we need to put all the stops. More options, the better.
If I can add to that, I feel like I've become the Beyond Meat and Impossible de facto promoter on the panel, which is not necessarily my position. Like, I actually agree with you. Like, I think the only diet that's been shown to prevent and reverse heart disease and all these other type of illnesses is largely a whole food plant-based diet for the most part. And so it's true that it's actually probably not that much more health promoting. But, meat might also have other ingredients like fecal matter, for example, not ingredients, but, conventionally produced meat has a lot of other things, antibiotics, fecal matter, et cetera, these other things that we should be mindful of. So, that's just like a thing to think about. But absolutely, these products are not necessarily healthy. They're sort of alternatives for people who are trying to sort of lessen their environmental impact and so on. I don't think they should be thought of as a health food because it's true that sort of natural foods like beans and legumes are sort of the way to go if you want to from a health perspective. But still, there is this interesting element of like because they're food technology, maybe Impossible 10.0, kind of it's like an iPhone. It kind of comes in these series, maybe they can sort of turn the dial up and down. So we don't actually know. It's like very, very early stages, and we don't actually have the research on it. But I wouldn't say it's a health food.
So I have been vegan for a little bit over 4 years personally, and I want to just give a little bit of insight as to what it seems like, kind of from, I guess, almost the inside looking out. I feel like I welcome everything that's coming. It certainly made it easier for me to eat, and I think it's that the world's moving in the right direction. I also want to focus on something, though, which is that basically, from a belief standpoint as a vegan, it's not about this environmental stuff, which honestly is not the biggest deal to me. It's not about just kind of some kind of part-way measure to feel better about myself or something like that. It's that fundamentally a belief that as a person, when if I go to a restaurant or wherever and ask someone to bring me meat, I'm basically saying to the person that I am taking responsibility morally for everything that went on to get that meat on the plate. It's the same as if I would do it myself. So it's not any different for me if I believe that a cow that has the same sentience as a 3-year-old child, if I believe I wouldn't kill that cow, then I'm not going to ask someone else to kill that cow for me. If I believe that torturing animals for food or killing animals for food is wrong, then I'm not going to make that personal decision to ask someone else to do it. And I'm also not going to go telling everyone, I'm a wonderful person and I represent all these different great causes, and I'm going to go stuff a bunch of burgers down my throat. So I want to share that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Norman Doust. I'm wondering if we can end on a more positive note, maybe by asking each of you, what kinds of good policy changes could we make that would incentivize good things, such as supporting small farms and entrepreneurs and those kinds of things? And what is your favorite policy change that you would recommend to make us all happier?
I think we have to keep in mind the whole picture of climate change, and diet in the food system is a critical part of that. But at the moment, it's not the biggest contributor to climate change. The energy sector is, it does seem as though the analyses show that carbon tax would be the most effective way to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas production. And of course, the higher the tax, the better. And that will have some effect operating through the food system too, because a lot of the industrial food system uses a lot of petroleum products that we basically convert to edible food. I think that still is actually the most important thing that we do. And then use a combination of subsidies and taxes to make it basically at least level the playing field. The playing field's tilted the wrong way at the moment, but we should tilt it in the way that encourages healthy and sustainable foods. And we know how to do that. We've been subsidizing dairy production in many ways. We do have to do it in a way that also recognizes that farmers have to have a decent living too. And we can't get supply and demand too much out of balance here, because if we just increase the production of healthy foods and there's not enough demand and consumption of them, the prices will crash and farmers will be in a bad situation. So the economics of it are somewhat delicate, but we can learn. We need to basically have the will and the commitment to doing that.
Nina?
Subsidizing big mushroom. No, no, but I like the idea of a tax related to the climate impact of food. Like, I think that, so it's great if you show people like a green sticker, like you should eat this, but actually if there's like economics behind that and it makes it you can see it in your wallet when you choose certain foods, I think that would, but I am Canadian, so I know this would be very unpopular in the US, but that would be my favorite policy.
I will absolutely second a carbon tax. I think I'm not quite sure why Republicans aren't still going for it like they were 25 years ago. Yeah, it's a great idea. It helps. Trump's whole anti-globalist agenda, carbon tax.
Well, I think
get it done.
It's even transportation tax, because if transportation costs go up, you have, I think, a much higher percentage of things being produced locally, because so much of the cost is dependent on transportation for the global food chain. If I produce 20 miles outside of Boston, for me to get it to market is basically nothing, where the guy is producing 2,000 miles from Boston. So I think it's more of a transportation thing, at least for us.
And my feel-good point is not a policy change, but my feel-good point is that life is over 6 billion years old, so it tends to persist.
But it might persist better if we're not on the planet. Sorry, that's not the best way to end.
That's not a happy note.
Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank... quick question.
I'll try to say something positive.
Yeah, that wasn't a question. That's
Come back from that.
I'll come back from that.
We're going to be on Martha's Vineyard in a couple of weeks, so definitely like to look you up. But my question is, one of the underreported side effects of climate change is what it's going to do to the labor population. People are going to lose their jobs. And so for the two entrepreneurs, how labor intensive is your business, and how labor intensive, say, is the meat industry, and is that going to make a difference? Will we be better off going to a meatless economy?
So I think it's interesting. So basically, meat has made the devil's deal, where they've become very carbon intensive in order to become efficient and not use very much labor, where we are much more labor intensive and not carbon intensive. So in a world where, let's say, oil gets more expensive or there's a carbon tax, our prices don't go up very much, but we can continue to use that labor at probably a cheaper cost as it becomes more available.
It's a good question.
Yeah, I don't know about the plant industry in general, honestly, but we choose to have higher prices and employ people.
Sure.
And not use oil. Also, another positive note, we brought a bunch of dried mushrooms, so please stay, buy a book,
Buy a book.
pick up some dried mushrooms.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you, Dr. Willett, Nina, Truman, and Tucker, for all coming here tonight. It's been very, very informative and inspirational. We're grateful for all your time and input.